Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud. Lost Stone. In this video, we're going to do part 2 of Little Blue Book number 873, titled Dwellers of the Pond, written by Carol Lane Fenton. Yeah. Copyright, I don't know. Is there a copyright date? Let me look. I don't think there is a copyright date here for this one. Although I do believe it was printed several times. Wait, let me see. I know there's a page here that I can refer to. This has started to come apart. First 2 pages. Yes, copyright 1925. I'm actually using the second page, which has the copyright date, as a bookmark. So, here we go. As you can see, there's the cover. The cover is completely fallen off. So we'll pick up where we left off in part 1. Mammals, like reptiles, are not abundant so close to the town, and the number of both species and individuals which I have seen about the pond is small. Field mice build their nests in the grass of the swampy pasture north of it, which the common rat lives among the trees of the former gravel pit. Occasionally, in winter, the snow bears tracks of a weasel, while rabbits feed upon the bark of the younger willows and frequently fall prey to hunting cats and dogs. In the larger trees, several colonies of bats spend the days hung bottom side up in the deep shadows of decay cavities. Decay cavities. Sounds like it should say decaying cavities, but it doesn't. It's decay cavities. I digress. Coming out at evening to hunt insects above the surface of the open portion of the pond. On several occasions, I have mistaken small bats for large night-flying moths, and once even captured a bat in my insect net. The furry little beast seemed very angry and stirred up a great fuss, nearly ruining the bob net of the net bag. When freed, however, he seemed in no hurry to leave, and clung to my shirt for several minutes before flying away. Aside from the bats, about the only wild mammals of the pond which are not in danger of extinction are the fox squirrels, of which a dozen or more live in the large willows. Their fur is of little or no value, and though there are plenty of folks who praise roast squirrel as food. I've had squirrel. It's delicious. The pond is too close to dwelling houses and chicken yards to allow for shooting. Now and then a youngster tries to bag a squirrel with his .22 caliber rifle, but promptly is chased out by an irate housewife, concerned for the safety of her windows and poultry. She may not give a hang about one way or another about the fate of the pond squirrels, but she is not going to lose good money through smashed window panes or dead hens, merely because some boy is too lazy to go beyond the city limits for his hunting. Thus, avarice, which destroyed the muskrats, preserves the squirrels. And as the town builds nearer and nearer the pond, their safety becomes more firmly assured. For the active little animals have no objection to houses, provided only that they are surrounded with trees, and they are not much distressed even by factory buildings. I have seen squirrels hopping about among piles of castings and eating crumbs in the shadow of flat cars, and occasionally they even wandered into the buildings themselves. Here, however, they were disturbed by the clang of hammers and the rattle of cranes, and quickly sought a way to escape to the outdoors. Whether the advance of the town, while not harming the squirrels, eventually will do away with the pond, I do not know, but the chances are against such a possibility for a long time to come. Already more of the depression has been filled in than is profitable, and the owner of the pond does not favor further work of that sort. The rest would be expensive to build up. There is plenty of land in the neighborhood, that is all ready for building, while on the other hand, not a new factory has been erected in the last 10 years. For sanitary reasons, the pond cannot be used as a dump, at least openly, even though under cover of night, not a few barrel loads of cans and rubbish are hauled to its borders. Most fortunate of all, there is a growing sentiment in the town that the pond is too valuable a refuge for birds to be destroyed, but that instead it should be kept as a nature sanctuary for the use and pleasure of nature study clubs and school children. If this sentiment grows more rapidly than the town expands, the pond will be saved. If not, there is more than a chance that it will join the muskrats as victim to the commercialism which years ago gripped Iowa's prairies and has not yet learned how to loosen its hold on their productive acres. That's the end of chapter 2. On to chapter 3, the pond in winter. Winter at the pond is a season of footprints. Even before the spreading sheet of ice has covered the surface, thin skiffs of snow record the goings and comings of the inhabitants. And by the time the ground is well covered, every morning brings to light a story of the doings of those beasts in fur and feathers, who refuse to change their abode even in the face of an Iowa January. I say beasts in fur and feather for good reason, since every winter resident of the pond who is not so protected hides himself securely away before the first real cold arrives. After a few light frosts and the formation of a little ice, the frogs beat a retreat to the marshy edges of the pond, where they burrow deep among the plants and debris. At about the same time, the mud turtles cease to appear on their accustomed log and do not show their dark shells again until spring. A patriarchal snapping turtle that I captured one day and carried to the pond stuck out considerably longer than his relatives. For one day in December I encountered his broad smudgy tail on the half-frozen mud. Oh, not tail, trail. But evidently this was his last trip abroad. For though warmer weather came a few days later, I saw no new tracks of the aged reptile, nor did I come across him in the spring, though some boys told me they had caught a snapping turtle in the slough, though through which the creek that drains the pond made its lazy way to the river a mile or so westward. I didn't see the animal and probably couldn't have recognized him if I had, but the fact that I never before had heard of a snapping turtle in the slough makes me think it was my own former captive, who had left the pond on a journey over shallows to deeper water. Eventually, he got there, for after playing with him long enough to be convinced of his chronic ill temper, the boys carried the old fellow to a bridge where they gave him a 10-foot drop into one of the stream's several bayous. Depends where you're from. They said he made a great splash and sank straight to the bottom, but one of them insisted that he came up immediately and set off downstream in the shelter of the young arrow plants. By far the largest number of the birds leave the region of the pond as autumn comes on. The thrushes, robins, vireos, blackbirds, wrens, and other summer residents gather for the fall migration, which is a much more straggling affair than that of the spring. By the middle of November, most of them are gone, and to fill their places come a few migrants from Minnesota and Canada that go no farther south. There are flocks of juncos, little gray and white sprites, that in Iowa go by the name of snowbirds, and the number of the chickadees, nuthatches, and downy and hairy woodpeckers increases greatly. A few individuals belonging to each of these species are to be found about the pond throughout the summer, but by far the greater number are winter visitants from lands to the north. Most of them Keep close to the willows and the patches of weeds near the pond, except when they fly into the town to visit some of the ever increasing number of feeding boxes and suet balls. Occasionally, one of the latter is fastened to a tree by the pond, but the birds it attracts seem to be too great a temptation for cats and boys with air rifles to withstand. Both are inclined to avoid a feeding station in someone's dooryard, but a station at the pond inspires no such respect. In addition to those residents, birds whose numbers increase during the fall and winter, there are others which show little fluctuation, whose flocks are as numerous at one season as they are at another. Most conspicuous of these are the crows and blue jays, which appear to find the pond a pleasant haven during even the coldest weather. Both of them steal a little corn from the poultry yards, and both welcome whatever contributions the bird students of the town may bring out, doing their best to keep other species from getting a share. In this endeavor, they are well assisted by the English sparrows, which fortunately are less numerous about the pond than its location would make one expect. Of the three birds, I like the crows best, for he possesses both individuality and intelligence, and at least seems to get good fun out of his mischievous pranks. The blue jay, on the other hand, is noisy and eternally quarrelsome, and what is worse, he frequently lunches upon the eggs or nestlings of birds whose habits are much more pleasant than his own. The sparrow, finally, is cussed no matter what side of him you consider. In his burly little head there is no desire to be either useful or pleasant. He fights with members of his own race and bullies smaller birds. He steals their nests and destroys their eggs. He builds everywhere and scatters rubbish and straw all along his path. Where the English sparrow is in abundance, no such bird as the warbler or vireo has a chance to exist, and he even drives away other sparrows of Native American species. Of course, every one of these traits helps to make him a successful bird, and I would not say that, as a bird, he is to be reproached for one of them. What I do say is that his dominant traits are traits that I dislike, and that make me consider him a pest. And I should be devoutly grateful if every English sparrow on the continent of North America could be exterminated at once, and future importation be made impossible. Such an event would be of greatest benefit to many valuable native species, whose welfare I consider far more important than that of the quarrelsome European bird. He really doesn't like the European sparrow. On bright days, the crows spend a good deal of time plottering about among the dry cattails that wave above the ice of the pond. I never turn the page quickly. Pardon me. I never have been able to see that this netted the birds a profit, for there is no food to be had among the dead plants at which the crows do not even bother to peck. Yet, day after day, they settle down upon the ice in little flocks, making queer throaty noises and gravelly stalking about on the snowy surface. Now and then, one of the birds will hop into the air, flapping his wings and cackling. At other times, the whole flock takes alarm and rises with a loud cawing of anger and fright. For some time I was puzzled as to the cause of these hurried flights, and then one morning my glasses caught a dash of dark gray among the cattails, and the problem was solved. There, fortunately, had been a light fall of snow the night before, so I knew there would be no difficulty in tracing the whole story and the marks that would be left upon it. First, I came upon the trails of the four crows, crossing and recrossing each other in the tangle of tracks that wound here and there among the dry plants. These I followed for 3 or 4 rods, and then came the point at which they had flown, marked only by a scattering of the snow, such as might have come from quick, vigorous strokes of a whisk broom. Finally, I located a second trail that ended in 4 deep footprints back of a clump of grass, from which another series of tracks retreated to the bushes near the railway. Plainly, some hungry cat had stalked the crows as they wandered about, and behind the 4 clearest prints, the snow showed where the animal's tail had twitched nervously as the birds came nearer and nearer. Probably it was this very twitching that had given the alarm to the watchful crows, for the light wind was wholly in favor of the crouching cat. Too great eagerness, then, had lost the chance of a meal, and the disgruntled animal had gone back to look for mice beneath the bushes. One cold December night I walked out to the pond and stood in the shelter of a large willow, which offered a little protection from the sharp wind. The moon sent down a pale greening light that showed the muskrat houses raising their whitened domes above the surface of the ice, and a robin's nest swaying in one of the smaller willows. The dry weeds and bushes rustled and crackled, and drifting snow sang a fine, high song as it cut against the dead stalks of the cattails, or made soft whisperings among the clumps of dead marsh grass. High up in the trees, a screech owl began his wavering call that rose and fell, and was repeated again. It lifted high and harsh and sank low like the voice of the snow among the brown leaves. It told of sleet and ice, of chill winds and beating blizzards, of still, dead cold, and the struggle for food and life that must go on through night and day above the white blanket of the snow. It was the winter voice of the pond. That's the end of chapter 3. On to chapter 4, the beaver's pond. Most of the organisms that dwell in ponds and lakes are, if one may use such an expression, parasitic upon their surroundings. That is, although they depend for their existence upon bodies of water which either are without currents or whose flow is very moderate, these plants and animals never do anything to bring such bodies of water into existence, but instead, by the normal business of living and dying, gradually turn them into dry land. In the ordinary course of affairs, a pond is not brought into being by living animals or plants. A river changes its course or fills up its bed, leaving isolated bodies of water behind, which we know as ponds or lakes. A great glacier moves over the surface and, gathering up millions of tons of gravel, clay, and sand, at last the climate warms and the ice melts away, leaving the debris of the glacier to settle down upon the land in irregular sheets, ridges, and depressions. Into the low places water drains from rains and the melting ice, so that what was but a barren hollow becomes either a pond or a lake, depending upon its size and the amount of drainage that enters it. Into the watered basin comes the seeds and spores of plants, the young and adult stages of vertebrate and invertebrate animals, following all the varied avenues. It was not long. Oops. Nope. I think I skipped a page. Yep, I did. Okay, here we go. Varied avenues by which organisms may achieve dispersal. And we're going to pause right there or hydration. I have cottonmouth. This hydration break brought to you by my friend Maddie. Hydrate, Maddie. Cottonmouth is the enemy of us all. Okay. Gradually, the flora and fauna of the pond is built up until at last its members become so numerous that their remains fill up the depression in which they live, turning it first into a bog and then into a flat, fertile meadow. The chief part of this filling is done by plants, since they far outnumber the animals in every freshwater community, and they are aided by sediment borne in the running water and deposited as dust by the winds. However, the shells, skeletons, and even the flesh of the animals contribute to the mass of material that slowly but inevitably turns the pond into something that no longer can be inhabited by water-loving species. In the Iowa pond, this process is as well shown as in those in Minnesota, or in the area back of the sand dunes that stretch in a narrow belt around the southern shore of Lake Michigan. Along the margin of the former gravel pit is an ever-increasing accumulation of leaves, twigs, seeds, and other rubbish from the trees. In this rich layer, the many water plants take growth, adding their dead stalks to the deposit as winter approaches. Dead snails drop to the bottom and are buried, to be joined by the bodies of tadpoles and minnows that have failed to make life endurable. In the open portion of the pond, the work of filling goes on even more rapidly, for there are rich growths of lilies, arrow plant, and cattails, which are lacking under the high willows. There also are more minnows, tadpoles, and snails, and many a young bird is drowned before it learns to achieve safety on the edge of a teetering nest. All of this, though it means incidental deaths among the races of animals and plants, brings certain death nearer and nearer to the pond. Like parasites, the animals and plants have come upon it in its youth. In it they have prospered and multiplied, and eventually they will crowd it out of existence and give over to other organisms, the remains which to the destroyers themselves have become worthless. Such is the rule of the most creatures that live in the ponds, but not of every one of them. There is at least one mammal whose life is spent largely in ponds that has forsaken the role of destroyer and has taken on that of builder. When he needs a pond, he constructs the dam that will bring it into being. Where the waters are not deep enough, he makes channels along the bottom. And when plants threaten to obliterate the basin, he adds height to the dam, even keeping it in good repair and strengthening it whenever necessary. But so unusual are these activities, so different from those of most animals, that thousands know of the beaver who never would have heard his name were his habits those of the weasel, the rat, or the antelope. For more than 3 centuries, therefore, the beaver has been among the most famous of wild animals. Early explorers and trappers in North America found the ponds and houses of the beaver, saw something of the animal's habits, and often wrote accounts back to Europe which read almost like fairy tales. For what eyes did not see, imagination and the tales of Indian guides readily supplied. And it was not long before the beaver of literature became a very marvel of skill and intelligence. His broad, flat tail was made to do duty as an axe, a sled, a pile driver, and a barge. His paws were turned into hands, and his crude houses into 2- and 3-story dwellings with doors and windows. More than one account tells of the animal driving by means of his tail piles 4 or 5 feet long and as thick as a telephone post, or towing loads of mud about on this same useful member, using it as a trowel to smooth off the earthly plaster after it had been dumped upon the house or dam. Each writer seemingly tried to get one better on the authors who had preceded him, and the less he knew about the beaver, the more free he was to romance. Of one of the worst offenders, the naturalist Mills has written, "The compiler of wonders of nature and art seems not only to have collected all the fictions into which other writers on the subject have run, but has so greatly improved them that little remains to be added to the account of the beaver besides a vocabulary of their language, a code of their laws, and a sketch of their religion, to make it a most complete natural history of that animal." Now, though I cannot speak for the last, my reading of books by 2 or 3 nature writers at present very popular with those who buy books for children convinces me that the first 2 of Mr. Mill's requirements have been more than satisfied. For though there are no formal vocabularies, the animals in these stories speak quite conventional, though very immature English, with but occasional errors in grammar. And though I have not yet come upon a legislature in session, there are plenty of judges, policemen, and calabooses, all proper adjuncts of an organized body of law. More than that, the authors have gone deeply into the home life of the animals about which they write, and tell us the color and cost of Mother Beaver's hats and the size of Willie Beaver's socks, which he hangs up for Santa to fill on Christmas Eve. Colored pictures show Grandma Beaver making patchwork quilts for the babies, and spotty young Algernon putting a sharp crease in his pants before calling upon the furry flapper of his heart's desire. And here, though my tolerance is considerable, it plays out completely, and I put the book in the pile of those which are to be reviewed without favor and hustled off to the second-hand man. For though my travels are not wide, nor my intimacies with animals many, I never have seen a beaver decked out in hoop skirts and bonnet, nor yet in jazz vest and bell-bottom trousers. The chipmunks that have nibbled my bacon and flicked dirt on the butter always have been plain rodents, with never a golf jacket or fedora among them. While the rabbits that have hopped curiously about camp wore neither swallowtail nor checkered knickers. In other words, the animals I have seen were plain animals, donning no clothes unless forced to do so by their trainer in a circus or zoo. And even then, they carried on no conversations in any language that I can understand. Nor do I believe that the author of Squirrel's Fuzzkin Follies has been a bit more fortunate than I, and doubtless he will be the first to admit the truth of this statement. Certainly he will reply, neither he nor anyone else ever has met a wild goose in calico, or a wild beaver in pants. In writing about such things, he has no intention of deceiving even the most gullible child. Rather, he dresses his animals up in order to make them familiar and amusing, gives them human ways and human intelligence, so that they will interest parents and children, and thus make his book sell. Also, he probably will add with righteous pride, by giving them the manners of men, he is able to teach the children lessons and give points to morals. Interest, not literal belief, is what he desires from his readers. Why then do I object? if the author intends to deceive no one but his fanciful tales? What grounds for complaints have I, who read Sandberg's Rutabaga stories to every kid that will listen? As I see it, I have several. For the one thing, the moral pointing business offends my sense of fairness and truth. It is bad enough to preach in any sort of a story for children, and a shame for every book which does so is not dumped into the rubbish heap at once. But to preach human morals by means of animal characters instead of human ones is still worse. For in addition to taking advantage of the child's desire for amusement, it gives him a wholly false view of animal nature. It impresses upon other species than our own a body of morality that is purely human, and largely a byproduct of the growing system of Christian dogma. But so far as I have been able to see, squirrels and beavers are neither human nor Christian, and from human standards are not to be considered either as moral or anti-moral. Their hereditary characters, their habits, and their environments are too different from ours for human standards to be applied to them, or if applied, to mean anything one way or another. That a fox steals chickens and kills mice does not mean that he corresponds to the human safecracker or professional gunman. In the society of men, an individual whose business it is to kill his kind is either an abnormality or a soldier, and that of foxes the killer is a necessity, unless the race is to die of starvation. The two sorts of destruction differ even in their biologic significance. For while the gunman destroys his own species, generally to no good end, the fox or wolf preys on other species whose flesh he uses as food, without which he and his cubs would starve. Thus it parallels it's thus if parallels must be drawn, they should be between all carnivorous and all men, for we are nearly as dependent upon meat as is the tiger or the fox. The fact that we have most of our butchering done by farmers and packing houses employees means packing house employees means nothing. For we eat the meat just as surely as though it were of our own capture. I doubt that Reynard, Reynard, is a bit more terrible to a mouse than the big sticker is to the shout. That does not make sense. Pig sticker is to the shout. I don't know. And of the two, the fox makes the quicker end of the killing. This distortion, which these writers put into the moral comparison they extend to all of our relationships with the animals. By nature, man is anthropomorphic as well as anthropocentric. Anthropocentric. The savage puts spirits in trees and skulls and makes offerings to the souls of the bear as well as to his grandfather. The dressed up animal story does not a little to perpetuate remnants of this savage superstition. It teaches children to think of animals not as animals, but as human minds in animal bodies, not as real creatures that may be studied and understood, but as distorted images of man about which we need to learn nothing. I venture to say that it is just as silly to maintain that a bear should not be kept in a zoo because some men dislike imprisonment as it is to hold that one may abuse his donkey because the poor animal has no soul. Kindness is one thing, and sentimentality another, and a movement that would put out of existence scientifically managed zoological gardens is of the same order as that which seeks to prevent vivisection in hospitals and medical schools. The same distorted vision which prevents us from getting a true impression of the animal world stands in the way of an unbiased consideration of humanity. The mind which has been trained to put animal intelligence, or put human intelligence, into the heads of pollywogs and robins is almost certain to insist on tacking a dualistic mind and soul onto the body of man. Few of us are ready to admit essential equality between the lower animals and ourselves. And if we raise the former to high levels, the only way to maintain our self-esteem is to boost human qualities into a realm of the metaphysical. Having done this, we decide that though it is possible to interpret the ways of animals in terms of man, it is sacrilegious to interpret those of man in terms of animal ways and activities. Again and again, I have noticed that the people who talk most about the souls of beavers and birdies know the least about comparative psychology and show little willingness to add to their information. They are firmly attached to dogma and to fancy, which, though it sometimes may be pretty enough, is death to real progress in the biologic sciences. And I think we'll stop there. That is the end of part 2 of, let me find my page marker, of Little Blue Book, number 873, titled Dwellers of the Ponds, written by Carol Allen Orkin. Thanks for listening, and join me in part 3.